Welcome to Your Future Starts Now, the go-to podcast for extraordinary women who are ready to step into their next chapter with authentic confidence. I'm your host, Gia Lacqua, empowerment coach, motivational speaker, children's book author, and girl mom. Whether you're a corporate powerhouse or an entrepreneur, this show is designed for you. Your Future Starts Now is more than just a podcast. It's a movement towards rewriting the rules of success for high-achieving women. Are you ready to get unstuck and step into your next chapter? If so, you're exactly where you need to be. Your future starts now. Welcome to Your Future Starts Now. I'm your host, Gia Lacqua. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I am so honored to welcome Dr. Urs Koenig to the show. Urs is a former United Nations military peacekeeper and NATO military peacekeeping commander, a highly accomplished ultra-endurance champion, a widely published professor, best-selling author, and seasoned executive coach and keynote speaker with more than 3 decades of experience helping hundreds of leaders and dozens of executive teams unlock new levels of achievement across 4 continents. He's the founder of the Radical Humility Leadership Institute and speaks frequently on the topic of leadership to corporations and associations across the globe. His message of radical humility and leadership has inspired teams from across the spectrum, including Amazon, Starbucks, the Society of Human Resource Management, Vistage, the University of Melbourne, and Microsoft. Urs, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you join us today.
Thank you, Gia. So good to be here. And I have to tell you, I love the name of your podcast.
Oh,
Your
thank
Future
you.
Starts Now. In my book, I know we're going to talk about this. I have opening quotes, and the opening quote of my last chapter is borrowed from a mantra in recovery groups, which says, nothing changes if nothing changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we don't make small changes today, the future won't change. So I love Your Future is Now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I love that. So true though, right? And that's really what the show is all about, or what are those small incremental changes we can make and across the various aspects of our life. So thank you for that. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background. You've obviously quite an impressive repertoire. Tell us a little more about you and kind of what led you to the work that you're doing today.
Absolutely. Very eclectic background, right? So, I really come from a world that's very results driven, very no nonsense, outcomes like ultra endurance competition, long bike races across the country, 3,000 miles and stuff like that, military peacekeeping and academia as well. So I grew up in a world that's very results driven, output oriented. At the same time, I'm a deeply relational person. I'm actually very, very emotional as well. And so I was always on the quest of finding how can we lead in a cutthroat, no-nonsense business environment or military environment with a more human-centered approach. And so I was drawn to this notion of humility in people, individuals, for a long, long time, but I never really studied it as a leadership trait. But then when I came back from my second peacekeeping mission, so I served 2 tours. I was in 2017 in the Balkans for NATO, as you mentioned, and then in 21 in the Middle East for the UN. Ironically, going back into a hierarchical organization like the military actually showed me that the best commanders are deeply humble leaders. They develop great self-awareness. They build meaningful relationships. They apply growth mindset. So anyway, when I came back from my second mission, I went, you know what? I'm going to dive into this research, what humility really can do in leadership. And so that was the quest, and the outcome of that quest is, of course, the book that I just published, Radical Humility. Be a badass leader and a good human, with a Venn diagram on the cover, which I'm very proud of.
It's amazing. So congratulations on the book. You launched it in March this year. And I love the cover. For those of you who are on YouTube, this is it. Radical Humility, Be a Badass Leader and a Good Human. And I love the title visually. And, just thinking about the title, it's so interesting. I'll be very honest. My first reaction when I saw the title is, wow, that's a powerful, powerful title. But then I had a second thought. And my second thought was, why is that such a difficult concept for people? It was almost like, why is that an oxymoron for people that we have to sort of bridge that gap? So tell us a little bit about your perspective on that and sort of what inspired you to write the book.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, we have this notion that we either have to be a kind person or a tough leader, right? So, and I would challenge that, and I do challenge that heavily. It's a false dichotomy. We can all actually courageously do hard things in a human way. I can be the toughest leader, the toughest executive, have the highest standards, and I can still build meaningful and collaborative relationships with my people. And by the way, this stuff is not all soft. Sometimes, and let's be real, the most loving thing I can do sometimes is actually let somebody go, right? And so, I agree with you. It's absolutely true that out in the world, people see this as an either or. And my quest really is to know we can do both. We can achieve badass results and at the same time build meaningful and collaborative relationships with our people, and not just see them as a wheel, or a cog in a wheel, but actually as humans who get stuff done for us.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I guess we sort of it's been ingrained in us that it is sort of one or the other, right? You're either tough,
Right.
driving results, authoritative, top-down approach, or you're quote unquote soft,
Right.
vulnerable,
Yeah.
empathetic, and maybe you're not getting the job done, right?
Well, and I have a story in the book about General McChrystal, like a tough military leader. He was commander of the task force fighting terror in the Middle East. And he shifted. He had the humility because the task force was failing miserably. They were always a step behind. They were very centralized, top-down command, control, organized, siloed, very top-down. And he had the humility to shift his leadership from what he called leading like a chess master, from the top, controlling his pawns on the chessboard, to leading like a gardener. What? As a gardener, you can't make plants grow. Much like you and I, we can't make our team members grow and bloom.
Sure.
But what we can and what we must do when we lead like a gardener is plant the right seedlings in the right spot at the right time, and then provide the environment, the nurturing environment, by watering and weeding. And how does this look in organizations? It looks sharing with full transparency. Actually, McChrystal got into trouble from the intelligence community because he would share information so openly and transparently, and at the same time building meaningful and collaborative relationships. He would say, my most important words were thank you and I appreciate you. So it's there's plenty of examples, surprisingly from the military primarily, that show that you really can do both. You can be a tough military leader, but at the same time take your people seriously and treat them with respect.
Love that. And if you could do that in the military, I presume you can do that anywhere, right? So and it's funny you mentioned the nurturing aspect of leadership, which is actually very near and dear to my heart, because as I evolved in my leadership role, I sort of early on in my career felt I had to be very stoic, non-emotional, especially as a woman, surrounded by mostly men. And as I grew and matured in my leadership, I realized that what people really craved was that sense of connection and the nurturing, and the fact that they felt that you genuinely cared, right? You cared about them. And so when I became a coach, someone that I had worked with, I had asked for feedback, and she said, you were meant for this because you're such a nurturer. And I had such mixed emotions when she said that, because on one hand, I felt exposed. I felt, oh my gosh, my whole career, I tried to filter that nurturer in me in my corporate career. And on the other hand, I said, wow, she really sees my superpower. And so it was such an interesting turning point for me to realize that it's more important to be genuine and authentic and vulnerable, right? And allow those natural qualities to come through than to stuff them down and to filter them and to be guarded and put on some facade. And so that was a really pivotal moment for me. And I know that you talk a lot about, vulnerability in the work that you do. So I would love to get, your take on the role you see vulnerability playing in
humble leadership, as you call it, and maybe just talk more about, humble leadership from your perspective.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing that, Gia. That's an amazing story. I love that. So yes, I put forward vulnerability truly is a leadership superpower. So it is, still to this day not understood properly, because when we think about vulnerability, we think we have to have trust first before we can show up with vulnerability. In fact, it's the other way around. And by the way, leadership is a thinking person's sport. So I have to be thoughtful about how vulnerable I show up in different situations. It's not a one size fits all. For example, when I'm new in a position, I might, have to earn my sharing with vulnerability with strong results first, potentially. But, and we're both obviously very familiar with Brené Brown's work, who says vulnerability is the last thing I'm going to show you, and it's the first thing I'm looking for in you. And there is so many powerful examples. Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, rock star status. People loved her. Why? She was a tough leader, by the way, super tough during the COVID crisis. I don't know if your listener followed that, but New Zealand was hard lockdown. She got into trouble later about it. The Christchurch terrorist attack, she handled beautifully, very tough leader. At the same time, she would open up with vulnerability about what it's like to give birth while holding the highest office in the country. And that made her relatable and propelled her to rock star status. And so vulnerability, and I quote another study actually in the book where pairs of complete strangers, and I love that study, are brought into a room together and they're tasked with asking meaningful questions and sharing meaningful information for 45 minutes. So things like, Gia, what does love and friendship mean to you? If you only had 1 year to live, what would you change? At the end of 45 minutes, the participants are asked to rate the level of trust they develop with a partner of 45 minutes. They've never met before. And they rated the level of trust about as high as the level of trust they have with the average person in their lives. Some even rated it as high as the level of trust they have with their significant other. And one pair, and I love that, one pair got married. So the research, I know, right? The research, you don't have to get married, by the way.
That's amazing.
Sharing or
what
showing
a story
up
to tell your kids, huh?
Exactly. So the research is crystal clear. Sharing with a bit of vulnerability is the quickest way to build trust. We all admire perfection from a distance. Nobody can relate to it. And so it's small things. Maybe I can share, with my teammates, small things we can start with. What did I do over the weekend? What are my kids up to? It's these small, and then it starts a vulnerability loop. You share something about yourself, I mirror that. I share something, and trust develops and the relationship deepens. So yeah, absolutely, it is a leadership superpower. No question. And by the way, last thing I say, coming back to the military, special operators, I do a bit of coaching with special operators who transition out of the military into the civilian life. Their teams are deeply vulnerable with each other. They constantly tell each other they love each other. They understand that being vulnerable together is the only way that the team can become invulnerable. So vulnerability within a team is a true superpower so that the team can pull off badass results and be super strong.
Sure. And that trust, right? You're trusting each other with your lives in some situations.
Exactly.
Such great advice, such a good point. And I think for vulnerability, I think has many negative connotations that we, again, have sort of been ingrained in our beliefs that we have to sort of unlearn, right? Because I think to your point about perfectionism, if you're trying to attain that image of perfection, people can't relate to it. And right, that sort of distances you from people rather than, I think the goal is, they'll idolize me, they'll look up to me, but no, it actually distances them because you're not relatable at that point.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I have one other example. Brad Smith is the former CEO of the financial technology company Intuit. He volunteered to do a 360. And then he shared his 360 with every single person in the company. He emailed his report out. Like, how about that for vulnerability? And by the way, I think of vulnerability in 3 acts. The first act is me. The second act is what I'm sharing about myself, maybe a weakness or an insecurity. And the third act, important, is what am I going to do about it? So let's not just stop at act number 2, but actually let's share also when we're, for example, talking with our teammates about something that we're working on as their leader, what we're doing to address it. So, so Brad Smith is a wonderful example of then making it safe for everybody at the organization to own their own stuff and start working on them.
I love that. Yeah, like you said, it perpetuates a cycle and that ripple effect of if I can do it, you can do it, right? Yeah. You're leading by example, and then it creates that culture and that environment where people feel safe to share, which I think is so critical.
Absolutely. And one last thing I do want to say, though, so vulnerability and humility is no replacement for competence.
Yeah.
So I think that's super important to stress when we're having these conversations. When I first deployed as a peacekeeper, I was out of the service for 22 years. So my knowledge was really outdated. And I owned that with my I had a team, I had a command. I owned that. I said, look, I'm not up to date and I'm not up to speed, but I'm going to work my sweet behind off to get there. And I did.
And so, you did, of course.
So the vulnerability and humility is no replacement for competence. Super important point.
Absolutely. Great point. So let's talk about, where you see in the work that you're doing today, where do you see people getting stuck in terms of that shift in leadership from the top down command and control to this concept of humble leadership? I know in the first shift you talk about in your book, it's dig deep, which is really about self-awareness. And I know a lot of times the work that I do in leadership coaching is, people think that they're self-aware. They say, oh yes, I'm very self-aware, right? And there's a couple different facets to that. Either you're not self-aware or you're aware, but you're not doing anything about it, right? Which I know is something you also address in your book. Right. But I would love to know from your perspective, where do you see kind of the biggest hangups that people have and challenges in making that transition?
You just bring up a great one, right? We all of us, including you and me, we overestimate how self-aware we are, right? Totally. So we have a total bias as humans there. I think one of the biggest challenges I see leaders face is their difficulty or sometimes inability to let go, and that this is almost too obvious to say, but to delegate and to empower. Why? As leaders, we like to be asked for advice. We want to feel needed. We want to be busy. Busy means important, right? So when I get asked for a lot of advice, for a lot of decisions I need to make, that makes me feel important. And so we all, innately have this need to feel important, if we're honest. And so to fight that urge to know everything, be in charge of everything, constantly be asked for advice or to make decisions, that's a huge hang up that I see people have. And I challenge them. The true test of leadership, Gia, is how does the ship run when you're not there? How can you make yourself obsolete, literally work yourself out of a job that in the day-to-day you're not actually needed? And people challenge me all the time, especially in small businesses. Wow, it's not really possible. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it can be done in teams of any size, even very small teams. How can I extract myself? Who else should do this? Everything on my to-do list, ask myself, am I the only person who can do this? And if not, who else can and should do this? What's the lowest level in my organization that can make that decision and then push decision-making to that level? So that's one of the biggest challenges I see leaders face, this need to feel needed and then inability to let go.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a huge, huge mindset shift. And it is undoing a lot of the things that we've been taught and that we've learned about being a leader, right? And sort of creating a different mindset of what being a leader means, right? To your point, it's not necessarily about being the most important or powerful person in the room. And, people needing to come to us for all the answers and being that bottleneck. I know you talk about we're in a VUCA world. And, right. That old way of the organizational thinking is just not working in the world that we live in today. And so empowering our people like the gardener I think is a great analogy, and really allowing people to flourish and take ownership. And that's a really hard thing, like you said, for people to let go of because of that mindset. And I do think, unfortunately, ego gets in the way. I think it does come down to, we don't want that ego to be distorted or damaged, and so we hold on to that very tightly. And I think there's a lot of inner work that is really critical for leaders to do, to work on that transformation in terms of their leadership style.
That, I think that's very well put indeed. And what I often tell folks is, let's have the best idea win, not necessarily yours.
Yeah.
And again, the true test of leadership: are you able to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, know more than you, and are you able to, be still in charge and move the team forward, facilitate the process, but you might not actually be the smartest person in the room.
Absolutely. It's such an important lesson. And, speaking of ego, it's very early on in your book, but I do want to read one line that really jumped out at me and was really one of my favorite things, sort of favorite takeaways or lessons, because it's similar. I'll talk about how I sort of think about it in the work that I do. But I think it was when you were working in Kosovo and you pose a really important question, which is, it dawned on me that even though I might never have the answers, I must continue to ask questions that are not about me. And again, I think we can get so mired into the details of the challenge or the problem we're trying to solve. And again, we think it's all about us. It's almost never about us, right? But we think it is. And so I would love for you to maybe share some of that story with our listeners, because I think about it in terms of when we get so stuck in the weeds. I like to say we have to zoom out. We have to zoom out and see the big picture and see, what it is that we are trying to impact on a broader scale. So I really love that question.
And I'll tell the story briefly, but just that's where a coach, a mentor, somebody outside of our immediate environment can be so helpful. And I'm not saying this because I've been a coach for a lot of my life, but I really feel it doesn't, it can be a family member too.
Sure.
You're so right. So I'm deployed in this peacekeeping mission. And as I mentioned, I have been out of the service for 22 years. Second day, I dropped my flak jacket on the hard asphalt, and I'm 50 years old almost. I'm being chewed out by a young sergeant who's like 25 years my junior. And I made such an effort beforehand and all throughout the mission, like, I can't be arrogant. I'm the oldest guy. I need to just keep my mouth shut. And I did, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but I did ask myself, how can I be sure I never ever drop this flak jacket again? So very self-centered, right? So this scene. And then we deployed, and we're in Kosovo, and we're invited to an end-of-year school play. And we're, as members of the peacekeeping force, escorted to the front. And then we watch 8 and 9-year-old kids reenact the Kosovo War, literally slaughtering Serbs on the ground, all to the roaring applause from parents, teachers, and other students. And so that's when I sat there, coming back to the big questions. I'm like, you know what? I thought I got this conflict. I studied it. I worked hard on understanding. I talked to a lot of people, and I'm sitting there going, I still don't get it. I don't get it. So I need to ask bigger and more meaningful questions, to your point, that are not about me. What are the stories we need to tell and teach these kids at home and at school, so that this conflict can really, or we can move beyond that conflict? And so this was a sort of a pivotal moment for me to realize that, first of all, humbling experience. By the way, that's true in the Middle East as well. You work in the Middle East. I only was there for a year. People work there for 15 years. You think you get it, and then something happens totally out of the blue, and you go like, you know what? I still don't get it, and I never really will. But the quality of my questions improves. The more I learn, maybe the less I know, but the quality of my questions improves, and that's important. And that is one of the cornerstones, on a more philosophical level, less tactical in terms of leadership, what humility is all about. It's about asking the big, hard questions we might never actually have a very satisfying answer.
Sure.
I know that's a bit philosophical, but
No.
less tactical. So yeah.
I love it. I love it. It's so important. And I think those philosophical questions and conversations are critical, right? To your point, even though we may not have all the answers, we may not have the answers we like, but at least it gets us thinking along, that train of thought, which I think is really important. You have another pillar in your book that I also love. It's tough on results, tender on people, which I think is also incredibly powerful and is really a great sort of way to think about, being a badass leader and a good human.
Right.
I think that touches upon the vulnerability and the empathy. And I would love to know from your perspective, how do you get people to really shift, the ones who are stuck in that traditional command and control, that way of thinking? Is there some tool, tip, trick that advice you would give people who are sort of still a little leery of, the vulnerability and the tender on people part?
Absolutely. Well, so I answer the question, but I want to just share the one pivotal moment I had around this tough on results, tender on people was, again, in Kosovo. I'm sitting in my commander's office and he opens the meeting with these words. He says, "Urs, I love you. You know I do. And your work is not even close to being good enough." So he, by the way, and then, we talked about what happened and whatnot. And now I shrank in my chair. Now, if he would have, chewed me out, yelled at me, I would have tuned him out.
Yeah.
I would, whatever. It's just, but he showed me that he cared for me. And of course, he didn't just say that. I mean, I understood from the last 6 months working together, he was keenly interested in helping me go to the next level and develop. He got me. And then for him to deliver that tough feedback, that made me really hear it. And so that's an important notion for all of us who, or your listeners who might be still a little bit hesitant, this relationship building. I don't need to have friends at work. When you build meaningful and trusting relationships, your feedback is much more likely to be heard and acted upon versus tuned out. When they know that you get them, that you care for them personally, you don't need to be best friends, by the way. Yeah. Although there is research showing that people who have a best friend at work are actually 7 times more likely to, hang around and not quit. Mm-hmm. So, so the notion that you build and deepen relationship. And by the way, this looks different for everyone. You will have different depth of relationships with different team members, and that's totally fine. With some of them, you just small talk about the weekend, and others want to talk about end of life decisions and the meaning of life, whatever. Right. And that's totally fine. That's absolutely fine. But again, your feedback and input is much more likely to be heard and acted upon if people know that you get them on a personal level. And so that's the business case. There's a business case right there. And retention, engagement, and all the research, and you and I are familiar with this. Gen Zs, they want meaning. Yes, they want purpose. Yes, they want also money, but they want deeper, meaningful, trusting relationships. They want to be cared for. And so if you want to have your people hang around, you better start getting on that boat.
So true. So true. It's a great point. It's so interesting. And the last thing I want to touch upon is, before we start to wrap up, humble leadership. I would love to think about or get your take on, for those people who maybe aren't people leaders per se, or people leaders yet, how can we use humble leadership to influence laterally, up, down, laterally? And I guess this is sort of I'll throw a curveball at you. How can we apply this concept in parenting? You're a father, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So
Two teenage boys.
Yeah. So I would love to know how you see that parallel.
I think there's huge parallels. And so, look, I have to ask you now too. You have a daughter, I think?
I have 2 girls.
2 girls. How old?
7 and 9.
Okay, so I have teenage. So teenage boys, 17 and 19. Mm-hmm. By the way, hardest job I ever loved, hands down. Most humbling experience of my life. Like, forget peacekeeping, forget ultra endurance, like parenting, the hardest thing, the most
hardest job
thing.
In the world. Absolutely.
No question about it. And the principles in my mind apply very similarly. I actually, look, I'm work in progress. A lot of things I have to work on as a dad. But what I do on a regular basis, I ask my kids for input and feedback. How can I show better up? How can I show up better in this or that environment? What did you see me do well? How can I do better? And by the way, leadership and parenting is not a popularity contest. I always ask, I always listen, but I make the calls. Like, you're still my teenagers, I'm the dad, and oftentimes I do make the calls. And so I think the notion of self-awareness, which is a key part, as you mentioned, of humble leadership, improving it by asking for feedback, reducing my blind spots in my parenting, absolutely applies as well. I write about my younger son in the book when I talk about the famous growth mindset, right? Instead of wanting perfection and being really concerned how his assignment is being perceived, he went and got input and feedback from his teachers and fellow students about what he can do better. And so sort of applied that growth mindset that, fortunately, they're now teaching in schools. It wasn't taught when I went to school. Yeah. I mean, I can tell you that. And on a personal level, that's going off on a tangent here, but that's actually my biggest challenge.
Yeah.
I'm still battling the fixed mindset, if I'm totally honest, and so anyway, so I think a lot of these lessons apply in parenting as much as they do in leading your team at work, no question.
I think it's so powerful. I think they are life lessons that apply across the board. And, as you said, parenting is, and I say it all the time, is the hardest job in the world. It's also the most rewarding, but, and they're evolving, we're evolving, right? Everything is just, the world around us is evolving. There's so many moving parts. So I think it is important to maintain that growth mindset and realize that we're never done learning and never done growing ourselves. So great advice.
I certainly am not as a dad, I can tell you that.
Yeah. It's a process. Right. Amazing. Urs, I would love to know from your professional and personal, your life experience, I would love to know how you define success for yourself and how perhaps that has evolved for you over time.
I think I'm probably fairly typical in that early in my life, I was probably chasing more sort of external successes, again, coming back to the fixed mindset, how are people seeing me, and, what races can I win, and what jobs can I land? And money was never really a driver for me, but, to some extent, like, what prestigious title can I have?
Sure.
And it's really evolved over time through my work in leadership development as a coach, and now as a speaker, and also as part of my peacekeeping, that if I can help one person, one team, one organization shift towards a more, what I call humble leadership, a more human-centered leadership approach, like, that is what success looks like. If I can help one parent, who maybe takes an idea out of my book and show up in a more human-centered way while still being tough, but always very clear about that tension doesn't go away. Like, that's what success looks like for me now. And really, we all say it's a bit of a cliche, but really making a difference and having an impact one person at a time.
Impact, for sure. I love that. And if there's one thing that you want our listeners to take away or consider doing differently after listening to this episode, what would that be?
Coming back to the vulnerability, reach out to the person you know the least about on your team and do a personal check-in. And if you're a bit introverted, maybe a bit shy, plan what you're going to reveal about yourself and what questions you might ask. And it might simply start with, how was your weekend? Quite literally. It sounds so simple, but that's where it starts. Like, that's how we build relationships, one small step at a time. So take that step.
Yeah. Put yourself out there.
Right.
And I think the other important part of that is think about the environment that you're setting, especially if you're an introvert, the other person's an introvert. Don't do it 2 minutes before you're in a big meeting room, right before the meeting starts, right? Be intentional about where you're doing it, setting dedicated time to do it. Maybe it's over coffee, right? I think that is really important too, because people think, oh, I can just check this off the box, right?
That's such a great, thank you. You're absolutely 100% right. Then let's not blindside. If the other person is also an introvert, like, can be super uncomfortable for them, let's not blindside them. Let's set the context. I think that's a great addition. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love that. So, I mean, whereas this has been such an incredible conversation, where can our listeners learn more about you, the work that you do, and where can they purchase a copy of your book?
Well, the copy of the book is in your Barnes and Nobles and, of course, on Amazon, like
Perfect.
we all know. And then for my speaking on the web, urskoenig.com, and the social media site I'm most active at is LinkedIn. So you can find me there. I'd love to engage and hear your thoughts on my work and learn about yours too.
Amazing. And I also want to just add that I love you have the QR codes in there in your book to download. So I think a lot of times we are very motivated to read books about self-development, leadership development. And I think a lot of people, myself included in the past, sometimes it falls flat because we read it and it's interesting. We're like, oh yeah, that sounds really good. But then we don't necessarily take that next step, right? So I love that you are able to provide tools and resources for people who really are interested in doing that work, right? To help them take that next step after they read the book. So such great resources in there as well.
Thank you. There's an assessment there, actually, a radical humility assessment you can take. So thanks for saying that, Jill.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much, Urs, for being here, for sharing your insights, your expertise. Thank you for your service and truly the work that you're doing.
It was great. I had so much fun. Thanks, Gia.
Thank you. And of course, you can visit my website at gialacqua.com, reach out on Instagram at gialacqua. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. This is Gia signing off with gratitude for your time and energy. Our mic drops, but the movement continues. Until next time, your next chapter is waiting. Take care.
That concludes another empowering episode of Your Future Starts Now. Before we wrap up, I want to thank this incredible community of high-achieving women. Your energy, resilience, and commitment to growth are the driving force behind what we do. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate it, leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Your feedback fuels our mission to empower high-achieving women just like you. And of course, share Your Future Starts Now with the extraordinary women in your life who are also on a journey of healing and empowerment. Connect with us on social media, share your thoughts, let us know what topics you'd like to explore in future episodes. Stay connected on Instagram at gialacqua. I encourage you to carry the energy of this conversation into your day and keep on supporting the incredible women around you. Until next time, remember, your next chapter is waiting.